Hi, my name is Felicia, and in preparation for Bridgerton Season 3, I hyperfixated like real bad and accidentally designed a massive project for myself in which I'm sewing all of these different Bridgerton Regency-inspired outfits. In this playlist so far, we've done the sleepwear set with a nightgown and a dressing gown, and then 2 different underlayer sets with short stays and shorts, as well as long stays and the chemise most recently. I'll be starting off this outfit with the dress made out of this gorgeous floral white chiffon and this peach satin for a lining. But before we can start sewing, we need a pattern. I wanted this dress to have the quintessential squared off neckline and empire waist of a Regency dress, but I'm not a big fan of a cap sleeve, so I switched it for a flutter sleeve. And to pattern the bust to underbust decrease, I decided to take inspiration from a few different Bridgerton ladies who have 3 darts in a line on each side. I used my basic bodice block as a starter to get the marking for the center dart, and then spaced my other 2 evenly on either side of it. Unfortunately, I didn't catch that my screen recorder had shut off, but to account for the extra material now needed on that underbust, I added a curved edge and a fold to the center front. I got rid of the darts for the center back, added a circle pattern for the sleeve, and a basic trapezoid for my skirts. The skirt will be made from the same pattern with 3 layers cut on the fold for the sides and the center front, and then 2 cut off the fold for the center back. With the drafting sorted, I printed out my pattern, assembled them together, and then cut out each of the individual pieces. Okay, pattern is officially assembled, so we're ready to start cutting out our fabric. Physically ready, that is. Mentally, emotionally. Cutting out fabric is scary, and it gets so much worse when you're doing it on camera. But I brought this upon myself, so we're gonna do it anyways. Now we're all ready to go. We've got our skirt panel, our bodice front, bodice back sleeve, satin, chiffon, and a great reason to procrastinate because I probably broke my toe and had to ice it. Yay! I wasn't really sure how much fabric to buy, so I bought 3 yards of each of these, but they gave me closer to 3.5 of the satin and around 5 of the chiffon. Ultimately, I think 3 yards was a pretty good estimate, but if you want something with more volume, you might need more fabric. That is, if you're actually going to make something like this. No pressure. I usually start out by cutting my biggest pattern pieces first, just to make sure I actually have enough room for them. Then use all the little random sections to cut out the remaining pieces. Cutting out the fabric took about an hour, but that did include a brief hunt for a new hosier vinyl, so in the end I had my 2 front bodices cut on the fold, 4 back ones cut off the fold, 2 circle sleeves, and 10 total skirt panels. 4 regular and 6 on the fold. So I believe it's important to show that things don't always go perfect on the first try. The bodice of this dress was very much an example of that. When I originally filmed the front bodice, I had 12 total darts to put in, and I added them separately between the outer layer chiffon and the satin lining. There was a bit of trial and error to get all of the darts equally spaced and in going in the correct direction, but even once I had each individual dart looking nice, I wasn't happy with the full look. Okay, I'm gonna be totally honest, I'm a little bit mad at myself. I didn't have a ton of plans for how I was going to make this dress, apart from buying the material for it. But the thing I did have a thought on at the very beginning of assembly was that I should probably flatline my chiffon and my satin, at least in the bust section, because trying to get 12 darts to line up was going to be risky. However, I didn't want to have to go to the store to get the ribbon that would be required to bind all of the raw edges around the neckline if I flatlined them instead of doing them as 2 separate layers. After spending a really long time last night, I can't get these dang darts to line up. Chiffon is the worst in any kind of structured element when you're trying to use it alone because it gets all warpy where you think everything is perfect and then you slightly move the fabric and turns out everything is miles apart. So we're gonna go to the store. We're gonna get the dang bias binding because I don't want to work on this right now. And then after that, we'll cut out new layers for the front bodice and flatline them together. After procrastinating a bit at the store, I came home and re-cut out my front bodice panel on the fold in both the chiffon and the satin. Next, I matched up my 2 layers for each pattern piece, wrong sides together, right sides facing out, and pinned all the way around for the front and the 2 back bodices. Once they were fully pinned, I took them over to my sewing machine and sewed all the way around with a not fully basting stitch length stitch, but a slightly larger one than normal just in case I needed to undo anything later on. Throughout this process, I made sure that my chiffon was laying perfectly flat on top of my satin, because if it was even a little bit warpy, you'd pick it up at the end and realize you have to completely unstitch it. It's a deeply irritating, slippery fabric. Okay, we are officially ready for darts take 3, I think, at this point. This time I've marked the center of each dart on just one side, and then I'm going to fold my bodice in half just to make extra sure they actually match. Okay, so we're starting out the same way we did last time, transferring over the center of the mark from the pattern onto the fabric. But just to make sure that they definitely line up on each side, I'm going to fold my fabric in half and transfer the darts from here rather than lining up the pattern a second time, just in case there's any wiggling and things like that. Center mark is in place on both sides. And this time, rather than attempting to mark the dart legs on every single dart at the same time, which got really tight, I'm just going to start with this center one and mark out the dart legs. And then, since we're only doing one at a time, I can actually use my pattern to mark the height of the dart, which was not an option last time because there's just too much going on. And then on the other side, we're gonna do the same thing. Okay, center dart is officially on both halves of the bodice. And the one thing you have to make sure you're careful about here is sandwiching both layers of your fabric as you sew your dart. Because if you've got a flat-lined piece, it's really easy for this outer layer to pucker and separate, and then you won't sew it down all the way and it'll look real weird. The dart is sewn from the raw edge to the fold, and instead of backstitching, I hand tie a knot at the end. After a quick press to make sure we're looking nice and cute, this is where we're currently at. These next 2 darts could technically just be straight. I have seen examples of that, but I think I want them to be angled. That's not an angle. I don't know what that motion was. Angled, like we did originally. And so what we're gonna do here, typically when you're doing a dart, you would line up the center mark and hold your fabric straight. We're going to just take this top edge and scooch it over a little bit so that now there's an angle there. So we'll take that and pin our dart length. There, I eyeballed that perfectly. I'm impressed. Pinning with a left hand, that's a weird thing. My hand is not capable of that. Okay, so now we have that, and we're gonna grab the dart leg. Okay, now to transfer it, I've pinched my fabric on the side that hasn't been pinned yet until it's about the same amount of angle between the center of the dart and the end of it. This video is gonna be so long, guys, I'm sorry. You're here, you can skip. ×2 speed is great. I watch everything in ×2. Maybe because I have undiagnosed ADHD, who knows. You know the drill. Sew the dart and then hand tie the knots to prevent any extra bulk at the end of them. Second set of darts is officially sewn in place. For set number 3, we're gonna do the same thing that we did with our first angled dart, but this time, instead of pulling our fabric towards the back like we did, we're gonna pull it a little bit towards the front. And one last time. Darts are done, so now we have to sew up the shoulder seams and the side seams. To assemble the bodice, I pinned both of the back panels to the front at the shoulder seam. Then I used a simple straight stitch to connect them, and serged the raw edges to make sure nothing frayed long term. I sewed the side seams up the same way, and then having learned my lesson from previous endeavors, I gave it a quick test fit to make sure I was satisfied for now. I didn't love how high the armpit was, so I went ahead and just top stitched a new shape there to make it a little bit lower. I freehanded one side and then did my best to match up the other. With the armhole finalized, it was time to add the sleeves. I set my machine to the longest setting and then ran a basting stitch about 1/4 inch away from the outer circle, all the way around that long edge. It's a bit of a pain to hem circles, but that basting stitch acts as a guide for your first fold, and then you just fold it down one more time to get a double rolled hem. After that was pinned in place, I set my machine back to its regular stitch length and sewed all the way around to secure the edge. Next I did another round of basting stitches, but this time along the inner circle edge, and then I pulled that until it fit into my armhole on the bodice. I pinned all the way around, then took it to the sewing machine to secure that pinning with stitches, and finally finished off the raw edges with the serger. After that, the sleeves were all done. The bodice was definitely the more complicated section of this dress, and now that that's done, for the skirts, we just had to match up the panels between the satin and the chiffon, sew the vertical edges, give them both a quick hem, and then attach the two layers together at the waistband. If you recall from a few minutes ago, we have one front, two sides, and two back panels, and the front and side panels are cut on the fold, the back ones are cut not on the fold. I started by pinning together my 3 folded pieces and then adding one back unfolded piece to either side, making sure that the straight line was in the center back, not connected to a side seam. At this point, I was leaving the back seam open so that it could be finished once I'm ready to attach it to the bodice. This was a ton of time-consuming straight stitching, but luckily I had good company, even if it was on the other side of a gate. They brought their banishment upon themselves, though, by repeatedly stealing my workspace and footroom and laying on my presser feet. But anyway, I eventually had 2 long skirt panels with open backs. The following day, it was time to assemble this dress. Before we could officially do that, though, the skirt required 2 more steps of prep work. First, I measured about how big I wanted the opening in the back to be. Then I pinned the back of each layer of the skirt up until that point. I sewed each layer closed individually until it had about the same 6-inch or so gap at the top edge. After that, I used a double-rolled hem to clean up the raw edges on both layers of the skirt. Folding once, folding twice, pinning in place, and then sewing down. Finally, I matched the 2 skirts around the waistband and that little opening space that we left in the back, and sewed all the way around that circle and down the opening. Now we officially have 2 almost completely assembled halves of this dress. To connect the halves, I matched the back opening on either side and then pinned both layers together right sides facing all the way around the empire waistline. Then, of course, once all the pinning was complete, I took it to the sewing machine to finish up the stitching on that waistline, following it up with a quick serge to clean the raw edges. With the dress at last in one piece, the final things we need to sort out are the raw edges around the bodice and the closure points on the back. When I was at the store, I compared a bunch of different colored ribbons like you saw and ended up bringing home this kind of periwinkle purple color. It looked cute on the swatch, but it kind of pulled focus on the actual dress, so I tried a few different other options, including the lining pink, a white, and then ultimately a green that will go on the trim for the jacket. In the end, I preferred the look of the green and figured it would go better with the Spencer later, so I got some sage green blanket binding. Blanket binding is unfortunately a single fold rather than the double that we need, so I cut out a length long enough to be a waistband, and then took the rest of the binding and folded each of its edges inward towards the center, then ironed them down, burning all of my fingertips in the process. Before sewing the binding on, I took that little waistband chunk with the fold side facing downward, and pinned it in place along the back of the waistband, and then wrapped it all the way around to the front, making sure it wouldn't gape or pull weird, then sewed it across the waist seam on either side of the back opening. I opened the remaining binding and pinned it in place along the raw edges of the bodice and that top edge of the skirt so that all of the edges were sealed. I sewed this one side of bias tape down, starting with the bottom of the opening in the back and going all the way around to the other side of that opening. When I reached the end, I sewed the layers together, trimmed the excess, and flipped the tape outside so that the fold was completely covering the raw edge. I sewed around the entire length of this bodice top one more time to secure the fold of the bias tape down. Then I flipped the dress right sides in, pinched the bottom of the opening together, and then sewed a straight line so that it would stay vertical instead of opening all the way horizontal like it wants to. Essentially, I converted that back opening from an obtuse angle after the binding to an acute one so that it would stay closed a little nicer. You may have guessed when I did a little test fit of the bodice, but it didn't close all the way. Not sure where I went wrong on the measurements, but this left me debating different options on how to secure the bodice. Thing is, I really liked the buttons that I bought for this project, so I cut out 4 strips of fabric that were the length of the opening, flatlined 1 satin to 1 chiffon, cut out 1 more layer of satin and flipped them right sides together. Before sewing one set of rectangles together, I pinned a layer of elastic loops in place along the raw edge and then promptly unpinned, unsewed, and flipped that so that it was going inward Then I pinned and sewed my right layers together on this rectangle and the one that doesn't have the elastic loops, leaving a small opening so that I could turn them both right side out. Little did I know that that process would prove to be Herculean, taking a whopping 7 minutes and 20 seconds to flip a single rectangular strip right side out again. After employing several random items, including my thread holder, I eventually got it flipped, and then, had to flip the other one. Sad times. But when they were both right side out with no raw edges, I gave them a nice press, and it was worth the effort. Then I pinned them along the center back to give myself just a little bit of an extension for the buttons and the button loops. Before sewing, I attempted to test fit this. It was a struggle. Then I embraced my sad fate and had to hand sew for a long time. I hate hand sewing, it's awful, but at least this way the stitches wouldn't show through on the binding on the correct side of the fabric. And last but not least, with the extension in place, it was time to add all of the buttons. But honestly, the buttons are super cute, I really like them, and they were totally worth all of the hand sewing that was required to make them functional. And now the latest installment to my Bridgerton project is finally done.